It was a rather hot night out. Not absolutely stinking hot, but that yucky, sticky kind of hot that makes it hard to sleep. On these nights, I can almost guarantee that my 8-month-old son will wake up at least 4 times. How can you blame him, though? I myself spend most of the night tossing and turning. Just to set the scene, my house is very small. You walk into our front door, to the left is a lounge room, which is an open plan with our kitchen, directly to the right of my bedroom. Next to my room, running off the other side of the hall, is my son's room, and then up from there is our guest bedroom, and also up that end is the toilet and the bathroom. Like most mothers, I wake up to the slightest odd breath that my child makes. Even despite him being in the other room, as I stated before, it was a yucky night, so I was expecting a long night of waking up constantly to settle him back down, which is why I was slightly unsettled upon waking up to his laughter and not his crying. My son is not shy at all. A lot of babies his age don't take to people other than mom, dad, and their grandparents, but my son loves anyone. I lay in bed for a few seconds, waking up properly to check my phone. It's 3 a.m. and I'm very sticky and hot and my baby is giggling like crazy. Which means again this is super odd, as I would expect to be woken up by crying. So I get up, and now, all this spanning over about a minute, I walk into my son's room to find a tall, skinny lady holding him, rocking him, and he's giggling at her. Her hair was at least down to her butt. With the dim light of my son's room, as he has a nightlight, it appeared that her hair was black, but at least half was now regrowth in gray color. When I think about her now, the word witch comes to mind. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure reading this I sound very calm, but at that time, and every time I think about it, I get this sickening hot feeling that starts in my stomach that just slowly takes over. This feeling in less than a second that had gripped me, and I felt my head spinning. My motherly instinct was screaming at me that I needed to calm down and not start screaming at this woman. She looked at me blankly and then stared back at my son. So instead of screaming at her, like my instinct suggested, I calmly said, "Oh, thank you for settling him. He's very fussy in the hot weather." There was a silence that felt like an eternity before she replied, "I thought you might like to sleep in. I didn't want him to wake you." Still wanting to scream or knock her out, but still keeping calm, I watched on edge as she tucked my son in and then said, "Good night," as she walked into the guest room, which the door is normally shut, but I noticed it was open as she walked into it. She shuts the door behind her, and then I swiftly grab my son, run to my room and grab my phone. Then I take us both out to the front while I call the police. They arrive to do what they do and enter the spare room. They find the window wide open and a fly screen on the ground outside. They checked the rest of the house and the yards and gave me the all clear. But I had decided that I'd feel safer elsewhere. So I packed a bag for my son and I went to stay with a friend. The next day, I was notified by police that a woman had been apprehended a few blocks away who matched my description. Turns out, she was mentally unstable and had prior incidents where she actually had violently attacked people who put her in stressing or scary situations. I'm just very thankful that my motherly instincts told me to keep calm and not scream at this woman who was kind enough to let me rest, as it could have very well ended badly. The thought still keeps me up at night.
If you're not familiar with what Meals on Wheels is, I'll explain. It's a community-based service, mostly made up of volunteers, aimed towards people who are homebound, most of which are the elderly or the physically disabled. The basic premise is that the volunteer workers deliver pre-made nutritious meals to those who need them, with many of the people needing our meals to help meet their daily nutritional requirements and to stay healthy. It's not a difficult job to do, and for the few years that I did it, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I got to meet and get to know a lot of very friendly people who sometimes would say I was the only contact they had with another human being at all. But that was before I started delivering to Mrs. Taylor. It's not that Miss Taylor was a bad person. She was just different from the other people I regularly delivered to. I didn't know much about her. To start with, she was 82 years old, and she had been a widow for some time. She lived alone in an area with no family living nearby, and the first time I made a delivery to her house, which was the only time her and I briefly exchanged words, she did mention having a son, but it had been some time since they had spoken. She mentioned something about having said harsh words to each other the last time they were together. I decided to leave the matter alone at that point. So other than me, Miss Taylor had no real contact with the outside world as she refused to have any additional checkups. She left specific instructions for her meals to be delivered and left on her doorstep, and that she would retrieve them later after I had left. This was not an unusual request, as there were other people who did this as well. So every time, I would walk up to her front door, ring the doorbell as per her instructions, and leave the cooler with food in it near the door. I then always take the empty cooler from the previous day back with me as I left. For some reason, I would briefly glance through the front window as I walked away, just enough to see her sitting in her living room chair, facing the television. I kind of felt sad each time I took that glance, feeling some amount of pity for her. I figured she had grown tired of any human contact, as I'm sure she had felt like her family had left her alone, although not intentionally on her former husband's part. I've had enough conversations with people like her to know this with certainty. So about a week went by, and then the routine continued on for the most part without much change. I got a new client here and there, but with Miss Taylor, it was always the same. The empty cooler was always there waiting, and she was always sitting in her chair staring at the television. Now, I couldn't actually see her face, so she may have been sleeping in the chair at that time as well. Sometimes I would wonder what else she did to help pass the time. One day the delivery was going as usual, except this time when I picked up the empty cooler and turned to leave, I noticed the front door had been left slightly ajar. Now, despite my instructions not to enter the home, I had an obligation to inspect and report any possible medication emergency to the authorities. I pushed the door slowly open and gave it 3 solid knocks. When I heard no response, I repeated the action, but this time I vocally announced my presence as well. I heard no response yet, and decided to enter the home, still announcing myself so as not to potentially startle Miss Taylor. The first thing to hit me was how cold it was in the house, despite it being the middle of the fall season. I had expected quite the opposite for an 82-year-old individual. I made my way into the living room towards her chair. I saw that she was sitting, facing the television, so I softly called to her. "Mrs. Taylor, your door was open." Nothing. No movement at all. "Miss Taylor?" It was then I came around to the front of the chair and made eye contact with her. Her eyes had glazed over, and her mouth was wide open, like I interrupted her in a moment of gasping for breath. "Oh, shit!" I blared out as I stepped back, and then made my second bad decision that day. I reached out and tried to find her pulse and to see if she was breathing at all, as I knew basic CPR. I grabbed her wrist, but I dropped it in a split second as her arm was ice cold to the touch. She was clearly dead, but I couldn't have known for how long. I called for an ambulance, but soon after they showed up, they confirmed my suspicions. They estimated that she had been dead for some time, as it takes a while for the body to cool completely after death has occurred. The police soon arrived and began to question me about what happened. I told them everything I knew about Miss Taylor and what I had found. They could see how shaken up I was, so they let me go, asking me to be available for further questioning if needed. My supervisor gave me a few days off to collect myself, but I had considered not continuing to make deliveries. I had decided against that initially, as I didn't want to let other clients down. I had really enjoyed getting to know all of them. The local news station had been reporting about my grisly finding of Miss Taylor, but luckily my face never showed up on the TV screen. I had not wanted to become a local celebrity, and definitely not like this. As I was listening to one of the reports one night, something occurred to me that had never dawned on me until that moment. Perhaps because I had been in the state of shock up until then. The news reported that Miss Taylor had been found dead in her home, and that it was determined that she had been dead for at least a full week. A whole week. I had been picking up empty coolers every day for a week. Who the hell had been eating all the food if she was dead then? I got my answer a few days later. Apparently, the police had suspected foul play was involved based on the information I had given them and by their own investigation. I'm guessing the missing food had something to do with it. One night, an unmarked patrol car was watching the house when the officers spotted a man sneaking out the back kitchen window. He was immediately detained, and the man turned out to be Miss Taylor's estranged son, the one she had exchanged words with some time ago. The police determined that he had returned to the house at some point, probably spoke with Miss Taylor and convinced her to let him in. They suspected that he had poisoned her with a cocktail of her own medication soon after, and then he was living in the house unknown to anyone else. It was later revealed that in the news he had a history of mental illness. Miss Taylor had been murdered by her own son, left her body in her chair, and had been eating her meals that I delivered. I wonder if any of those days I had looked in at her through the front window, if he was watching me through another window somewhere. Who knows how long she would have stayed in that chair, rotting away, if I hadn't paid attention to the door that day. Maybe her son had left it open intentionally, to lure me in so he could kill me as well. I'll never know for sure. She didn't deserve that kind of end to a lonely existence. Nobody does. The day after I heard that news report, I quit working for Meals on Wheels for good.
Just a bit of background. My mom works in a mainstream hospital, very busy, and she often drops me off at my friend's house before her parents go to work, just so they can take me to school. I was around 9 or 10 at the time, and my friend was a bit older. Her little sisters were about 5 and 6. One morning, I went around extremely early because her dad had to go into work to pick up his tools and just to finalize a few things. Before school, he took us to the house that he was working on, and we played in the garden, waiting for 8 o'clock to come. We were running around the garden, and I remembered we were making our own games, and one of them was about witches. The youngest sister, Rachel, was the cat, and the middle sister, Katie, was the witch. The witch had to go into the back shed and pretend it was her house, while we were sneaking in, trying not to get caught. I've always had an eye for weird stuff, you could say. Like, my dad's bathroom is a no-go, and my nan's bedroom is a definitely not. The vibes in these places were just too much for me, and being in there itself, I may as well come face to face with whatever inhabitants lie wherever in it. The shed was no different. I looked through the murky glass window, faded and ugly green color, and all I could see was a rake and a lawnmower. But they ran out because Katie had said, "I can see you." I was waiting for my go, but as I stood near it, I heard someone distinctly say, "Get her out of here, or she won't have the chance." Immediately, I spun my head around and I screamed so loud that her dad came out. I told him I heard someone say something, and all he could say was, "Don't let them play near the shed, Louise." I was so confused, and I could still remember the voice if I surrounded myself with silence. Her sister didn't come out of the shed, so I was just about to go and turn the doorknob, and behind me I heard Katie's voice. "Are we playing yet? Oh, do you want one?" she said, holding out a packet of sweets. She had gone inside and hadn't played the game already. I backed away from the door and I pieced it together in my head. I just never told anyone. So I ran, only to turn around and see a demonic face staring back through the window. It was a tall, skinny figure, red-skinned and hunched. I think its eyes were black, but I didn't dare look into them. I remember Rachel constantly nagging at me about if I heard someone talk by the shed. I told her only what I told her dad and nothing else. Rachel is now 13 years old and has been in counseling for about a year now, trying to get out the cause of her chronic nightmares. A few days ago, I slept at her house after a family party I was invited to. We got onto the topic of hauntings and shit when Rachel told me a story of that day. When me and Louise went into the shed, Katie wasn't in there. We ran out because we were scared. We heard noises and the shed was empty. Although... She stuttered and I could see she was debating, telling me anything further. No, I need to say this. I saw claw marks across the back of the door, and Louise and I ran out, but as I did, I felt something claw at my leg, and as I ran, I saw blood trickling down, and I looked back to see if I'd cut myself, and I saw... I saw this thing. All these years of thinking that they just ran out after being caught, and the reason was there in front of me. But that wasn't it. I ran and ran inside, and then when I saw Katie, I ran back to find you, and I saw you talking to Katie. I made eye contact with whatever was standing at the window, staring through your soul. My blood ran cold when I saw you going to open that door, but when we left, I swear to God, it told me, "I won't forget you." My heart sank as I realized what she'd dealt with, but something I would never admit to is leaving that door open.
My little brother Stevie was a total nuisance growing up. The summer that I was 11 and he was 7, my mother wanted us both out of the house. Every day I would go out, play with my friends, and Mom forced me to take Stevie with me, much to my dismay. It wasn't that I disliked Stevie. We had some good times when it was just the two of us. However, I started to get older. It wasn't cool to have your kid brother tag along. My friends and I spent our days racing our dirt bikes, playing cops and robbers, and checking out the porno magazine that my friend Kyle had stolen from his dad's stash. Stevie hadn't had his training wheels off his bike for long and couldn't keep up as we sped through the streets. He would cry if he lost a game, and being 7, couldn't keep a secret to save his life. He ruined everything. One particularly long day near the end of summer, we ran out of things to do. Kyle, Jeremy, and Scott wanted to head inside and watch an R-rated horror movie that Jeremy's older brother had rented. I would have loved to escape the heat and watch a movie, but there's no way Stevie would make it through a horror movie without crying, and he definitely would have tattled. Desperate to keep my friends from abandoning me, I suggested a game of Ghosts in the Graveyard. Everybody perked up at that. It was a group favorite, and simple enough that even Stevie could play. Scott biked home, got his sister, Stephanie, and her little friend Lizzie. Jeremy knocked on doors and managed to gather up 2 more players, Mike and JoJo from down the street. All in all, we had 9 players, just enough for a pretty epic game. If you've never played Ghost in the Graveyard, it's essentially tag backwards. One player is the ghost and hides. Everyone else has to try and find the ghost, and when they do, shout, "Ghost in the Graveyard!" as loud as they can, and then everyone else runs back to the home base as fast as they can, and the ghost tries to tag them. Whoever gets tagged first is the new ghost, and the game starts over. Once everyone was ready, I went over the rules. Our street only, no hiding inside, no hiding anywhere we weren't allowed to go, and no switching hiding spots after we started looking. Then we all put our feet in a circle, and Jeremy started the traditional chant of bubblegum in a dish to decide who was it. Scott got picked first and ran off to hide, while we covered our eyes and counted to 50. Mike found Scott pretty quickly, hiding behind his mom's car. Scott was fast as heck and tagged Jojo, who wasn't far behind. Jojo, a great climber, hid in a tree in my yard, but I found him anyway. He tagged Lizzie, and Lizzie became it. This went on for almost an hour before Stevie got tagged just as the sun started to set. Stevie ran off to hide, and we all covered our eyes and counted to 50. Then we all took off running to find him. I checked his usual spot in our backyard under the playset. But he wasn't there. We checked behind trees, under cars, under front porches, and everywhere else we could think of, but he wasn't anywhere. I bet he went inside, I thought. This is just like Stevie. Eventually we got tired of looking for him, so I agreed to go check inside our house. My mom had arrived home, but hadn't called us in for dinner yet. She worked pretty late, so in the summer we usually snacked until she got home. "Mom?" I called as I entered the kitchen through the garage. "Have you seen Stevie?" "No, I have not. You didn't leave him here while you went out and played, did you?" Her tone was sharp, but her eyes were concerned. "No, we're playing Ghosts in the Graveyard. He was supposed to hide, but now I can't find him," I groaned. "Well, you'd better. Dinner's almost ready." She turned back to the boiling pot on the stove, and I ducked back outside. Another 30 minutes of searching turned annoyance into worry. My mother came outside looking for us, and when I told her that we hadn't found Stevie yet, she grew concerned. As it had gotten dark, those of us who had flashlights went and got them and kept looking. "Stevie!" we called out as we looked. "The game is over. Mom says it's time for dinner," I shouted. Eventually, kids started heading home, and my mom called the police. I was convinced that Stevie was still hiding somewhere, not believing that the game was over, proud of his hiding spot. Mom was worried sick, afraid that he'd been kidnapped. The police brought flashlights as well and helped us sweep the neighborhood and the surrounding woods, even though they were technically out of bounds. We didn't find Stevie that night. Alerts played on the news for the next few days, and police came and went from our house frequently. I wasn't allowed to leave the house at all. A few days later, the police called the home phone asking for my mother. She hadn't been to work since Stevie went missing, and she took the call with haste. They'd found Stevie, but not alive. I wasn't given all the details as a child, but recently while visiting my mother, I asked her what happened, and she finally told me the whole story. Stevie had climbed inside a garbage can on our tree lawn to hide. The forensic pathologist who examined Stevie's body had said that due to the heat, lack of air circulation, and dehydration from playing all day, Stevie had fallen asleep inside the garbage can and didn't hear us calling for him. None of this would have been such an issue if it weren't for the fact that Stevie went missing the day before garbage day. He was found at the dump, his body mangled and crushed by the garbage truck's compactor. My little brother Stevie was a nuisance growing up, but from the day we buried him on, he was a nuisance that I wouldn't have minded.